When I took on the team at Uber, I took on a team of two people. That was the
Yeah.
smallest team I had ever led in my career. But that was also because I took on that role mostly because my personal belief is like, you don't have to look at the number of people you manage. It's the impact that you can create. And if you're a
Yeah.
good leader, a strong leader, you can continue to multiply and grow that out. I took on a team of two, grew that out to about 70 mobile engineers. And that was a fun journey.
All right, man. Look, really excited for this conversation. I'd love for you to give an intro of where you're from and the experiences you've had. I think the reason I was really excited about this one is because you've got such a specific skill set and experience for so many years now of pre-IPO high growth companies going all the way through IPOs. So I love it for a few things. One, because it's just great to see someone who's found the type of work they enjoy and gets to focus on that. And also because I think so much generic advice just breaks when you shift stages. And so it's awesome to be able to speak to engineering leaders of pre-IPO high growth companies at the moment. But love if you could just give the overview of your CV.
By the way, I'm glad to be chatting with you as well. So my name's Anant. I lead engineering currently at Included Health. Included Health is a personalized all-in-one healthcare company. And so we integrate expert care, guidance, financial and administrative support. So basically bringing access, answers, and advocacy together. We are a pre-IPO company bringing basically technology to healthcare. And that's been super duper fun. Before this, I was at Uber. I got to work Uber pre-IPO, worked on multiple different things, got to work on growth, driver, and a bunch of incubation and new product ideas there. And before that, I worked at LinkedIn, worked LinkedIn pre-IPO as well, worked on the relationship teams, a lot of things to do with the contact graph, got to build one of the early mobile teams there as well. My history has largely been is I like to work at companies that are pre-IPO that are using technology to disrupt a particular industry and change the way we as people experience our lives. So LinkedIn did that with our professional and social identity, how we think about applying to jobs, but also just how we show up in a professional environment. Uber did this in the way we move around the world. Included Health is doing that in the way we interact and engage with our healthcare system. And so for me, these are very meaningful and interesting problems. And having to do so at a pre-IPO stage and post-IPO stage has always been a fun journey. And I really always enjoy doing that.
Very, very cool. So, look, I'd love to jump into Uber first, and I'd love to ask you questions about the engineering culture. But to set it up, I think we all know Uber back in the day was a controversial company. But for me, that was looking as an outsider. At the time, I was living in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and a massive wave of unemployment had ripped through the city. So there was about 1 million unemployed, I remember at the time. And the thing that often us in developing countries we forget about is if you're unemployed in America or Australia or Europe, it's terrible, but you'll get by. But I remember at the time, if you're unemployed in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and there's another 1 million unemployed people with you, you're just survival wise in a lot of trouble. There's just no support network to get you food or shelter or anything like that. And so that was right at the time when Uber just took off like a rocket. And I remember it got about 400,000 people to have a level of income that meant they could afford food and shelter and things immediately. It was funny for me because at the time I saw this just incredible life-saving company. But I think that was right when the Uber and Lyft wars were in full force. And so it was you guys were finding each other on all fronts. I'd love to hear, what did it feel like inside the company at that time? And what was the culture like?
Yeah. By the way, thanks for sharing that story because that makes it very real. And I do remember my time at Uber.
Yeah.
When we were working on growth, you saw those stories and you kept thinking a lot about it.
Yeah.
Uber, in many ways for me, has felt like a once in a lifetime generation company for a variety of reasons. One of those was also just the market itself. Capital was very cheap. It was very much of like, how do you grow? How do you grow quickly? But I think there's probably more occasions like this that will happen, but at least for me personally, that felt truly one of a kind. The culture there, I would say, again, I think about too much of a good thing being a bad thing, but let's focus on the good thing for a moment, right? Like the good thing here was you had a high amount of autonomy, high amount of freedom. There was a culture internally, which was about how do I get stuff done? One of our views used to be is like, if someone came up with an idea, oftentimes you look for all the reasons why it won't work. And you say, oh no, it won't work for this reason, won't work for that. the culture actually pushed you to think about this. And I was like, no, you can't say no to this. You have to come up with how can you make it work. And it part of this actually a large part of this stems from Travis, who had this notion of like always be hustling. And I think parts of this is for him, his own pre-IPO or his startup journey that he'd gone through. And so I really absolutely loved it because it forced you. And again, as an engineer, that's the fun part because you want to solve problems and
Yeah.
you want to think about how can you make them and solve them more creatively. Um, and I definitely saw that at Uber, like the speed, the execution, and how the company did it was fantastic. Now, I think there's other sides of this which you can look at and say, like, there are things that I wish the company did differently, and there are things
Mhm.
that hadn't happened the way they did. But if I were to focus again more on the good of it, like I think the company and the culture was amazing. The people were incredibly smart, talented. There were gaps and things that needed to get better, but my personal experience at the company was nothing short of rewarding. I learned a
Yeah.
lot in the process. I am where I am because of what I learned at Uber, because of the leaders I worked with, and I'm grateful for my time at the company as well.
Yeah. I think that's also a bit of nuance that obviously gets lost is nothing's all good and all bad. And in a company that size, of course, there is vastly different experiences and there's no way around that. Could you give me maybe some practical stories of what you mean by that, like, let's get things done culture? Because I think everyone would like for their engineering teams to have a culture of, yes, let's get things done. But it's harder to actually implement through your team. Was there a manager that ran his teams in a particular way or a particular process that you guys are running to contribute to that? Because it's undeniable that that's what Uber was better at than anybody else.
Yeah. The first one was the obsession with metrics and data. Being part of the growth team, we used to have trip goals where it's like, we need to hit X number of trips. And you just saw that as a metric and it was obvious, very visible across the
Yeah.
board. And everyone's like, let's go aim toward that. And the simplicity of a metric, here's my
Yeah.
metric, I need to go move it. The clarity of like why this metric is important to the company and the business. So you can say, this is what I need to do. And here's why it's important. And the ability to make changes and the autonomy to make those changes. So, for example, if you're on the
Mhm.
growth team and you have carte blanche across the product experience of the changes you'd want to make. And this largely happens at larger companies where at times you end up having surface ownership versus metric ownership. So surface
Mhm.
ownership being, oh, I own homepage, I own this part of profile, I own this. And so anytime you want to make a change, you need to now get permission. Or the other team
Yep.
says, no, we are making the change, go away. And then you have to work through their roadmap. And that whole thing just slows you down. That
Yep.
sort of change in focus really meant you went really hard. The second thing was a comfort level with inefficiency. I think as engineers
Mhm.
and as people, we often look at say like, no, I want to build the best solution the first time, or I don't want to have duplication of code. I don't, and like, that is not how the company thought about it. Like Amazon used to have this saying, I believe, which used to be two is better than zero. Oftentimes what I see is engineering teams, engineering organizations will try to build that perfect one solution. And so you end up with no solution versus having two or three less good solutions that kind of prove you out and whether or not this makes sense. Now, Uber
Yeah.
also had to go back and reconcile that reality in the future. So you can't live this way forever. And like the company has done a tremendous amount of work changing the technology stack and things like that. But when you're an early stage company that is really thinking about how do I live or die and like how do I work through it, oftentimes two is better than zero. And again, the capital
Yep.
markets and all those things also sort of fueled that quite a bit. And that was unique and amazing. The third piece here is also, I think, this alignment from leadership, and it starts from the top. Like, and this is this notion of like, no task is beneath you type of thing that really,
Mhm.
that's something that I took away as a leader. There was a time when we were having this conversation about going into China, and one of the things we were getting stuck by was procurement. Travis in that meeting was like, do I need to go to a local store? I will go buy these things and I will personally fly it into China because I want to unblock it. Now, this is a funny story in hindsight. I remember that meeting being like, what is going on here? But what it showed you was like the leadership and people are not are willing to roll up their sleeves and we'll go push through this. Now, same things you just saw all the way through. And so what it caused folks to say is like, look, I am not going to get blocked. Like I cannot get blocked. What do I do?
Mhm.
How do I make that happen? And I've been thinking a lot about this in the context of what's the job of a leader, right? The job of a leader in many ways is what do you reward and what do you punish?
Mhm.
And maybe within that, it's like, what do you tolerate? So are you okay when someone comes in and says, oh, I couldn't do it because this other team said no? Or are you going to give them are you going to push through and work through that? And so that was the intent. Now, there was a cultural value Uber also had was called toe stepping. The unfortunate bit was it actually became a bit more weaponized in many ways. And like, I think it was interpreted as go be a jerk. But that is not the actual
Mhm.
intent. The actual intent and the story behind this was there was a time where an engineer went to Travis and told him like, hey, I don't want to do this because I want to step on this other team's. I don't want to step on their toes. And Travis was like, no, that's the right thing. This is the right answer. I need
Mhm.
you to go do this. And it sort of ties into this notion of best idea wins, meritocracy, this notion that there are no sacred cows in this context. That was culturally pushed through. And so I think that
Yeah.
was the intent. I oftentimes try to disambiguate intent and sometimes the implementation of it because one of the things I saw, or you could imagine, is as the company gets larger, those things sometimes get lost. But the idea behind
Mhm.
this was if you think you have the right idea, push, advocate for it. And then it was also on leadership on the other side to support and enable that in a constructive way.
Yeah. I think there's also an underlying thing that uh, I'd love to dive into as well is that there's a quality of person question there as well. Like you can give people a lot of autonomy and let them step on toes and deploy code to parts of the code base that aren't theirs. If you trust that person's judgment and the fact they can have an intelligent argument with who might be the owner of that area. So what was am I right that you built a team, like you helped scale up the team while you were there? What were the rough numbers that you scaled?
Yeah. So when I took on the team at Uber, I took on a team of 2 people. That was the
Yeah.
smallest team I had ever led in my career. But that was also because my personal belief is like, you don't have to look at the number of people you manage. It's the impact that you can create. And if you're a
Yeah.
good leader, a strong leader, you can continue to multiply and grow that out. I took on a team of 2, grew that out to about 70 mobile engineers. And that was a fun journey. Again, I had the pace at which Uber was doing that was super fun.
Well,
Yeah.
that's what I wanted you to talk into is how do you hire 70 good quality mobile engineers? Like, okay, you say capital's cheap and you had a lot of money, but you still have to get the right people. Like, how did you run that process?
Yeah. So this was hard. It was also very interesting in the sense that oftentimes when we think about Uber today, we think of like, oh, wow, of course, it's a really known, cool tech company. When I had
Mhm.
joined, I remember doing a tech talk about the topic of what are the technical challenges at Uber? Because most people I spoke with, they would look at me and say, Anant, what's hard? Like Uber works.
Yeah.
I push a button, there's a car. Like, why is this complicated? And you would have to go through and be like, oh my gosh, I have to tell the vision, the story. What are the things we could do? And that was a big part of it. The first part underneath this is to attract great talent. You need to have a good vision for what you're trying to do. That vision has to be something that you can articulate, that you personally believe in. And within that, it can also then help you understand the type of talent you need. Oftentimes, when I see people trying to hire, they don't have a vision for what they're trying to do. They can't communicate, convince people in that
Yeah.
regard. But that clarity also then helps you understand the talent you need. Do you really need 20 mobile engineers? Do you need 5 mobile engineers and 10 backend engineers who own more of the backend complexity and things like that? And so understanding the skill sets you need plays a big part. Now, the other side of this, the other reality was if you were to go back in 2014 and look at which companies were truly mobile first, Uber was the prototypical definition of that
Yeah.
company. And so from that angle, it was a little bit easier to attract talent. And but the piece that I would give advice to people, and even like the advice I take myself, is like helping people understand how their role uniquely contributes to the company's mission and why
Mhm.
now is the right time, why now is special, because it creates a sense of urgency, a sense of interest. But if an early stage company or a startup, especially as a founder, you think a lot about this unique moment. If I have someone now, this can truly alter the trajectory of the company. And
Mhm.
so you need to be able to articulate and talk through that. And that's a big part. Now, within the interview process, again, this is sort of your general standard. Like you do this set of questions that you want to cover. And like the thing that I have taken away, and we really think a lot about this at Included Health is like, I'm looking for strengths, not for reasons to not hire you. And
Mhm.
so we've spent a lot of time thinking about what's the right skill set do you need? We look at here in terms of like, we're looking for people who are humble, hungry, smart. And like, and when I mean smart, I mean like people smart, not just like book smart. But the idea is like, how do you fit into the organization, the culture, and do you have the right people aligned in that? Anyways, and so those have been some of the lessons there. The other part for me, by the way, I was actually just reflecting on this is like at Uber for about a year time or so, we were hiring about one engineer a week. My team was like, oh my gosh, cool. I realized actually we were looking at this even at Included Health for the last 3 quarters or so. We've been hiring an engineer a week as well. So in many ways, I see some of that. Uber as a company was hiring way more engineers. One other thing that Uber did was Uber implemented the bar raiser program, much like how Amazon did this, where you had an independent leader in the interview process. I share that because I think it's a tactic you can use to build trust between teams and organizations. There was clearly some amount of mistrust between teams. So you would have this, oh, this person's team has an amazing talent bar, or that person's team, although they hire poorly. The bar raiser program played a huge part in standardizing and building trust across the organization. Final thing I would say, like, depending on what's your tolerance, like, I don't think Uber hired everybody who was amazing. There's this notion of like hire slow, fire fast, but like this notion of like, are you optimizing for false positives or are you optimizing for having fewer false negatives? False positives is like, I can just hire people a lot faster, but there might be some people that I shouldn't have hired. I hired them. False negatives that only hire amazing people, but I will run a lot slower. So this notion about willingness to take some risk is also part of this here. And we hired across all levels. And that was also one of the good things for the company, because investing in earlier talent was also made it so they grew with the company, and there was also loyalty and things like that.
Depending on what was my last unpleasant experience, I go backwards and forwards on that false positive. What does a false positive do more damage than a false negative, etc.? Where do you sit today? Like building the team at Included Health, are you more inclined to turn down a candidate who and risk the false negative or risk the false positive?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I think the part, and that totally resonates. I think the thing that you just said in terms of your blast radius or the negative impact you can have, that's the big thing. And so in here, like for leadership roles and more senior roles, I'm okay with passing on people that I may have missed out, but that's okay. Because it is so important to me that getting the right leader in the right role is super important. You go all the way down to like a new college grad, it's hard, right? Like they have so much, like there's a lot of potential opportunity and things like that. You kind of look at and you can make that bet. The criteria that I've often used but like that's usually your most black and white things, right? Like usually what you have is a person that you talk to and you're like, hey, this person's amazing in these 3 areas, but I have concerns about these 2 things. I don't know they will be good at this, or will they change? Will they get better? Like that's more of your traditional view. Here, what I do is I look at my former manager, Wade, used to ask this questions like, do they get it? Do they want it? Can they do it? Person get the gap. Like let's take, for example, you and I are chatting and you're like, look, Anant, your gap is you have terrible time management. If I don't get it, it doesn't matter. You can keep telling me, but I don't get it. So the first question is like, do they get it? So I'm like, okay, cool. Anant gets that he needs to better improve his time management. The second is, do they want it? Like I could say I have bad time management, but I don't want to change it. I'm perfectly happy with the way I am. And that you have to really dig in to understand through questions. Like someone you see gaps, like what have you done differently to help you get that? And what would you do? And why are they seeking this out? You see this in interviews where someone will say something like, I care too much, I work too hard. But then you kind of pull in deeper and you realize they're not doing anything different about it. Just kind of like, because you have to ask, someone has to say I have a weakness. And the third, and this is oftentimes the hardest one because you're making a bet, which is, can they do it? And so this is where I sort of sometimes look at is prior experience as an indicator for future performance. Like when is a time in their past where they learned something new? When is a time in the past where they adopted? When's a time where they have stood out from a crowd that was truly exceptional? So like I can see that growth mindset, that capability. And oftentimes I'm also looking at this performance with complexity. Like in their past, as complexity increased, did their performance improve? If so, if they get it, they want it, I have a pretty high confidence they can do it. And within that, by the way, there's also my own bandwidth. So that's the other part that I find with leaders. They're like, oh, this person cares so much, I want to give them a chance. And then you realize the manager doesn't have the bandwidth to coach them, support them, or mentor them. And so within the can they do it is also me. Like, am I good at this? Like if someone is asking to learn something and I'm really bad at it, I may not be the best leader for them. And so that's the other element that I look at in terms of false positive, negative side of this is like, are the things that they need to get good at, can I teach them? Am I really good at this? And so that's kind of the model. So that's sort of the framework I've used here at Included Health. But generally for leaders, we'll obviously avoid having to bring on people who are not ready yet.
I really like that framework. It almost starts to ring alarm bells for me when I can't map the person's weakness. I'm sure Mark Zuckerberg has things he's not good at. When you can't find that anywhere, it normally means you're not doing reference checks correctly, or you haven't designed a good interview. Or the most common error I see people making is they're so desperate to make the hire that they ask the questions in such guided ways that the answer comes out strong. I've definitely fallen prey to that. I wanted to chat about your approach to AI at Included Health. So this got me really excited because at its base in health, doctor time is money. Like that's a super constrained, super valuable resource. And they deal in words and big, heavy textbooks and long insurance contracts, et cetera. And so you can conceptually really understand how AI could be a massive improvement for the health industry. How are you guys thinking about the impact on your company and the products that you can build?
Yeah, that's the thing that we spend a lot of time talking about, because you have AI, especially in the healthcare space, you're delivering care to people. I have oftentimes thought about this in the context of when I worked at LinkedIn or Uber, there was different things at stake. Not that they were any less or more important, but like when you're dealing with healthcare and someone's health data, that actually does feel more, it's something, it feels much higher.
Yeah.
The other element of this is also different people, especially if you care or the diversity of population that we serve, have different comfort levels with AI. And by the way, there's pros and cons. One of the conversations, we're doing a bunch of user research on this. And there was a conversation where some people felt more comfortable talking to AI about their health conditions than to a human.
And if it's like an embarrassing health condition or something like that.
It didn't even seem embarrassing. They just felt more comfortable about it. But yeah, embarrassing would probably be a part. Like for me personally, there might be times where I'm like, oh, I feel really dumb asking this question. And so I get to ask this to an AI thing, and that helps me. The way we're really thinking about this is like, I think AI can have an impact at multiple different tiers. The first tier is just how it helps us internally in how we do stuff. So we use AI, for example, for our software development. Like it can help us write better code, find bugs, write tests, things like that. That's very simple, straightforward. And you can apply the same thing for different functions. You can apply this for legal, finance, HR, and things like that. But it doesn't make your company an AI company. I think it just makes you a more efficient company. And I believe every company needs to, in some way, shape, or form, embrace it, because the efficiencies afforded by AI will make it inefficient to run an organization if you don't. So that's the first core piece of this. Now, the second part of this is we now then think about how can we use AI to help build better tooling for the people who serve members. So here, what you can do is things like, I'm about to talk to you. It can pull in all the data about my prior health records information, summarize it, and say, oh, Anant has these 3 things, and I can give you better insight about it. These are things that, again, this is where you have to think a lot about HIPAA and healthcare data and things like that. But given that we do this in our systems and things like that, we are able to provide insights on this. So the idea here is, how can I help our clinician be much better or be more efficient in the way they do things? It's not just our clinicians, our care coordinators, nurses, things like that. And then you can imagine things like scribing, like summarizing notes, giving insights, if you will. And this is stuff we can uniquely do because of the data we have. We are a company that leverages your medical records, your health information, as well as your insurance information to give the member a personalized experience. So it's more so just from a member's perspective, you may not see the AI, but from a behind the scenes, AI shows up. And by the way, when I mean AI here, it's like machine learning and some amount of generative AI as well. But these are new and old technologies we've been leveraging. The final piece is like, how does this show up to the member? And so we've been doing a bunch of these experiments about this. And like, oftentimes people think about AI in the most basic, like chatbot. And we've had experiences with chatbots. Some of them are good. Some of them are actually very annoying. And some of them just feel like added friction, that I just have to talk to this thing so that I can eventually make it to a human who's going to help me on the other side. We've spent a considerable amount of time building up our systems. For some of our pieces here, we support general administrative questions for you, like what's a deductible, to how much is this procedure going to cost? Coverage related questions to, is this doctor in my network or things like that? And we can do that at actually exceptionally high amounts of accuracy and a lot faster as well on this. There's the final piece of this, which is how do you create a differentiated product experience in the context of AI? This will show up in how does it improve your member experience overall? The idea here is we are building product experiences around pharmacies. A lot of the conversations in the health space has been around Ozempic and what are the pros, cons about this, whether it's right for you? How do you think about weight loss? In the specialty side, it's dealing with cancer to menopause to weight management. And so again, you can imagine how you have a personalized AI assistant that really thinks about you and can support that. My personal view is I want to build, if you've seen any of the Iron Man movies, I want to build the Jarvis for you, right? Like Jarvis, how Jarvis understood Tony Stark and all Tony Stark's health needs and could help him through that journey. I want to build that for healthcare. And that's sort of the future world that I want to get to. And like many ways, when in 2008, when Steve Jobs said there's an app for that, there's not an app for healthcare. And you can say, what about Apple Health or Google Health? I'm like, well, if you have a cold or a cough, you're not opening that app. Typically what we do is we go search for it online. I want that to be included health. And so that's where I think generative AI plays a huge and massive part in helping members guide them through that healthcare journey.
You said you appreciated the impact story beforehand, but it's what you're working on is, to me, one of the most inspiring things. I had someone very close to me go through a cancer experience recently, and it is this shocking cancer experience. Someone close to me had cancer, and it was this shocking kind of old school experience where it blew my mind, but doctors don't agree on things that you would think are simple, like, what's the impact of diet on cancer? They have very varying opinion. And the experience you have to go through is, you mark a consult 2 weeks out and you talk to him and he has one opinion, then go to another doctor 2 weeks later, they have a different opinion. And you want to be able to say, hey, can you two talk and give me the summary? Doesn't work like that, you know, but the information is out there. It's just that, in the UK, they do things one way, in the States, they do things another way. And so that, Jarvis vision you have where you could tap into those bits of data is, super inspiring.
Yeah.
But you said something I found fascinating there, that you'd use the data and included health to do things like summarize notes for a patient or be able to consult on like Ozempic. Those sorts of applications, do you think they're going to be built by, I've seen a lot of standalone players try and build things like that. Do you think those sorts of apps are going to come from standalone, or do you think the winners will be building that inside larger companies?
Yeah. So there's two components to this. Like there is the building the AI LLM models, and those I think will be these larger companies which can either raise a massive amount of money like OpenAI or have the financial capital to invest in it, like Google, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, and things like that. The solutions on top are largely going to become commoditized unless you have data that can separate. So I think a lot about this in the context of like clinical scribing. Like at some point or another, there will be many solutions to do this. And at some point, you're going to be looking at the way you're going to decide is first is going to be cost, like how much more expensive you are. And second is going to be how accurate is your translation piece of it. As more and more of these LLMs and systems get better at that transcription, that differentiation is going to get smaller. And so I think that's going to inherently become commoditized. So a company in this space, what you have to get really good at is how do you leverage data that can power all of these things? And I mean, this was the same pattern that happened back when web came up. Like everybody was building up websites, but like the reason why social media websites became great or what differentiated them was the data that was built on top of it. Theoretically, you could build all of them. And like, I think Facebook and LinkedIn did a phenomenal job in consolidating that data and creating network effects, which I think others did not do as effectively. Same thing is happening with like, if you look at it in terms of airline bookings, data becomes the thing that sort of separates you. And that's the thing that gives you staying power. For us at Included, we think a lot about this. And we also think a lot about the privacy of data and security of that data. And so for us, we are always aiming to say is like, how can we think about this data that delivers a better experience for the member? That's that whole bringing the mind, body, and wallet, all three things together. And that's very rare, right? It's those elements. And then AI can be a thing that facilitates, or can be a partner for you in working through those things, or a guide or an assistant. Simple stuff here could be you ask an AI bot a bunch of series of questions that you would typically go look online to answer. And
Mhm.
then at some point it says, hey, Anant, like your questions are actually pretty complex. Might I connect you to one of the best specialists in this space? And
Yep.
that context and everything that's carried over. And while I'm having this chat, the AI can again constantly listen, and afterwards it summarizes the conversation. And then you can
Yep.
ask it questions like, hey, the doctor used some really fancy word. I did not know what this is. Can you help me understand it?
Yep.
And it does that
Yep.
for you. And so it can be this seamless dance, if you will,
Mhm.
between the AI and the human and how they both work together. I think that is going to be very unique. That you can't recreate if you are building an LLM platform or a one off, like, let me do some transcribing. So
Yep.
that's where those things will differentiate.
Look, it's a tech podcast, so I've got to dig into the impact on software engineering that you spoke about. How large an impact is it having on the engineering teams at the moment, and what are the tools that they're most using?
Yeah. So it's been interesting. So we use GitHub Copilot. We've also built up our own in-house like basically integration with all of our LLMs. And so as an engineer, we call this chat IH. That's the blog post Will
Mhm.
Horton also wrote about. But the idea here is you can ask it questions and we'll answer it for you. Now, the hardest thing, and this is not just an AI problem, it's like a hard problem overall for us to look at is like developer productivity is oftentimes very hard to measure.
Yep.
We've done a phenomenal job as an industry measuring impact and things like that. But how do you measure output of an engineer? You can use story points, you can use various different tools, but each metrics can eventually be gamified and it ends up becoming a
Yep.
negative incentive report. It's a similar model for us, but we have actually invested quite a few into some of the tooling in-house to be able to measure this. We use a combination of qualitative internal surveys plus your DORA metrics, which is like looking at release, how like defect rates, things like that, and also a set of other qualitative metrics at the aggregate level for the team, like how quickly can I ship stuff to production to how often are things stuck in PRs and things like that. So that's a big portion of that. Uh, Generally speaking, if I were to talk to the engineers and depending on how often they'll use it, like we did a survey earlier, which had said like about 10 to 15% improvement. Now, again,
Yep.
it kind of will vary depending on the engineer, but you will oftentimes, we have a Slack channel on this and you'll often see stories with someone being like, oh man, I had to figure out how to understand this script that was written by an engineer 10 years ago or 8 years ago. I pasted it in, it explained it to me and I had to convert the script from here to into Python and it did it for me immediately. And oh my gosh, way easier. And so there are like, you have anecdotal stories. In many ways, I think it becomes the norm of development, much like how you and I would not really debate whether or not you need an IDE or should you use Vim to do this. Like maybe
Yep.
like, but it just solely adds up to your sort of developer tooling and things like that.
Yep. Yeah. No, look, I remember the first time I pulled in a gem in Rails and the whole sign up process, took like 4 days. Oh my God, it's incredible. And then sure enough, I had all the problems of integration, etc.
I mean, I think there's a lot of amazing stuff happening here. Like if you look at AI agents that are like Microsoft rolled out, that is incredible because you can then have agents that do work together for you and they solve the problems for you. And
Yep.
like I think about, I mean, there's a world of like eventually will robots take over the world or things like that. But even in the next 5, 10 years, the way we develop software is going to be so different than the way future generations will develop software.
Yep.
And what they develop may be vastly different than how probably you and I learned how to code. And by the way, that's a good thing because I think what you'll have is the ability to do way more, where it's like a similar leap from going from assembly to coded languages is going to
Mhm.
be similar, where you're not building the primitives. The primitives are built for you. You're now actually building the next level, next pieces. And I think it's going to unlock a higher amount of creativity from software engineers and things like that. And I look forward to that world in many ways.
Sure. Most tech leaders at the moment have kind of consolidated around that image and the details change, but most people kind of imagine, a world where AI does a lot of the work of the more junior work and you maybe manage a few of them. But then when you ask people, okay, how much of an impact it's having today, most answers are similar to yours, 5, 10, 15%. what do you think we're missing before we see that step change in ability to create and code much faster? What are the blockers you think that we're waiting to be solved?
Yeah. There's been a couple of things in here. I mean, there's a part of me that thinks about what's the human touch, and like, will an AI bot ever be able to replace a human over a long term? Like, that's maybe like a more even like a philosophical question and like what it means to be human, what have you. But within that, I think there's this notion of deeper critical reason, being able to understand different pieces associated with that. And I think it's getting better, right? Like you see this with the latest Chat GPT version of this, which is like they're starting to add more reasoning and explaining that.
Yep.
And I think that's going to become a function of how much compute and how fast the companies or organizations can scale that. But maybe in the next couple of years, I do think that's going to be there. The other part of this is, how does this work with humans itself? And I think a lot about this in the context of self-driving cars. Like
Yep.
would we move faster with self-driving cars if they didn't have to deal with humans on the road? Because then they can be interconnected. They can be like, hey, I'm about to turn left, I'm about to turn right, and they can all talk to each other.
Yep.
I think that may be much faster than a world where you have drivers and self-driving cars working in the same world. And I think a bit about that in terms of AI and things like that, because a lot of software development is also interacting with people. It's you and I looking at a design and saying, should this button go here? How would this work? Those are inherently human. And I think that is a bigger piece that needs to translate. And the third is the interface by which we interact with AI. Today, it's largely as a chatbot thing. But I think that's going to change. And I'm actually very curious on the notion of like variables and VR and AR, like what Meta announced with Orion. I think it's going to have to be much more embedded into our lifestyle, where I think what you can imagine is a really amazing engineer who has AI agents who can do side work for them. So it's that they are now able to work 2 or 3 times faster than what they did before. And I think that's the more likely scenario, where they are doing more of that human conversation. And so in a world where you and I are chatting about like, what do you think of a button? I can be like, hey, instead of us having a theoretical conversation, let me just show you 5 prototypes. And then you can be like, that one. And I can say, go code it. And it codes it for me. And it's like, so you sort of augment human and AI together. So that's at least what I think is the delta there.
Yep. I do think that the interaction with humans is a really insightful point, because 2 recent experiences I had. One was trying to get a AI developer agent to work, and I just could not get it to test its work. And if it was a junior engineer, I would have said, listen, if you don't test this before bringing it to me next time, you're going to have to find a new job. And the other one was, I saw a guy he'd ordered his self-driving car and it had driven past him. And so he was like frantically yelling out, stop, stop, stop. The car can't hear you. It's those breaks when like you expect it to be a human and it's not, that are the ones that kind of break humans' minds. And so, we'll need to adapt to using them as tools, not as human replacements.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I do think eventually robots will play a big part in our day-to-day lives as well. And I believe voice will probably be a bigger and larger interface by which we interact. That's a future world. The current world in itself is super interesting and exciting with all the changes. I like both of your stories. The Waymo story personally relates with me as well. I have definitely had that experience. Not that I was running, but I was waving at it thinking it will come to me, and it did not. And I had to walk.
Yeah. And then you realize what you did and feel like an idiot.
Exactly.
But, look, Anant, I think we're running up against time, but where can people find you if they want to reach out with more questions?
Oh yeah, the best way is actually just LinkedIn. Just reach out to me on LinkedIn, and that's where I have built my professional network and my professional identity. So that's a good spot to do this.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, man.
Thanks for having, and I also really enjoyed your questions and us talking as well.